This time, on combat ships, October 1944. The greatest sea battle in history.
Leyte Gulf is a microcosm of naval warfare. Anything you want to see, you can find there. Battleships, submarines, kamikazes, everything.
What would have fired the American crews was the opportunity for revenge for Pearl Harbor.
The world's biggest ships.
When one of those giant battleship shells hit his ship, his gunnery officer later wrote that it was like a puppy being smacked by a truck.
And hundreds of aircraft.
One instant, I was watching an airplane flying through the air. The next instant, it was just an engine.
In 3 days of white-knuckle combat.
The Japanese were fighting without a tomorrow. Their orders were, you're going to do this or die.
Combat ships. Fast. Effective.
The mission is pure James Bond espionage.
Deadly.
Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to stop the United States.
They have changed the world.
Warships have been key factors in global history, from the beginning of civilization to the present day.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews. On October 20, 1944, U.S. forces invaded the Philippines. In one day, over 130,000 American troops and 200,000 tons of supplies landed on the island of Leyte. 2 U.S. Navy fleets patrolled Leyte Gulf and the Philippine Sea to protect the invasion.
We had battleships, we had aircraft carriers. The landing force had battleships for shore bombardment, cruisers, had many transports, hundreds of transports, thousands of landing craft of all sizes. You had literally thousands of ships involved. They all came to one bay off the coast of Leyte. They landed 4 divisions, which is quite a large force. When you think about it, there were only 5 divisions when ashore in D-Day at Normandy.
General Douglas MacArthur, who the Japanese had forced to evacuate the Philippines 2 years before, watched from the cruiser USS Nashville.
You can imagine what a moment this was for him. For years he'd been promising, "I shall return," and now he returns. And there's that famous photograph of MacArthur striding ashore, getting wet up to his knees, fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines.
The Philippines were a key strategic target for the United States.
In mid-1944, the Americans see victory in the offing. Their plan is unconditional surrender, and their plan is the occupation of Japan. And their priorities are to get the bases and the locations where they can bring the ultimate amount of pressure upon Japan.
In the vast Pacific, the Philippines were one of the few places close enough to launch a direct assault. They were just as important to Japan.
By 1944, the Japanese had recognized this war was not working out the way they had scripted it. But they also knew that if they lost the Philippines, they would lose the war, because lacking the access to the oil of the former Dutch East Indies and the rubber and the tin of South Asia, they would not be able to continue the war. And so they knew if they lose the Philippines, they lose the war.
Over 80,000 Japanese troops were prepared to defend the islands to the death. But those forces would be cut off unless their navy could force the American fleets out of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese admirals devised a strategy to do it. They hoped it would be decisive and lethal. It was called Show 1, Victory. 1.
It's going to be a very complex thing that involves a number of fleets moving in different directions and hoping to arrive simultaneously. So it's just enormously complex.
The Japanese activated Show 1 as soon as they detected the Americans heading for Leyte. 4 Japanese strike forces sailed for the invasion beaches, 2 from the north and 2 from the south. Their aim? To catch the Americans in a pincer movement, sink the U.S. transport ships, and isolate the invasion forces.
Strategically, by the time we reach October of '44, Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to somehow stop the United States.
The greatest threat to the U.S. invasion came from the 2 fleets that made up Center Group, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It was the largest force in the Imperial Navy. 5 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. Leading the Center Group were 2 mighty battleships, the largest and most powerful ships ever built, the Musashi and her sister ship, Yamato. This massive replica of the Yamato was built for a Japanese museum.
Yamato is a term that simply means the fighting spirit of the Japanese people. And when fully armed and launched, it displaced 73,000 tons. Largest battleship ever built. And it was a beautiful ship, beautifully designed. And it had guns of 18.1-inch caliber, which is larger than any other gun and could outrange any other gun. The shells were enormous. They weighed 2,000 pounds each. And they could fire from 25 miles away.
The surface of the sea, when hit by a shell from Yamato, would have splashed as high as the Eiffel Tower. Its destructive power is beyond words.
Yamato and Musashi were designed in the late 1930s to take on the U.S. Navy.
The Japanese Navy was much smaller than the American Navy. Because of that, they needed a ship larger than the American battleships, a ship that would definitely not be defeated in individual combat with the Americans.
Yamato and her sister ship were built in secret, away from foreign spies.
As the Japanese Navy kept it so secret, neither the American Navy nor the British Navy knew about the huge guns.
It's the threat, it's the image, it's the whole psychology of having the biggest, baddest weapon, which has all the power.
One officer wrote of the vast ship.
There are arrows telling you which direction is the front and which is the back. Otherwise, you can't tell. For a couple of days, I didn't even know how to get back to my own quarters.
At 3,000 tons, just one of Yamato's gun turrets weighed more than a destroyer. Because of their size, the decks had to be over 130 feet wide. This posed a potentially fatal problem for both Yamato and Musashi. They'd be an easy target from the air. The Japanese Navy hit upon a simple solution.
To make it hard to be seen by American airplanes, they painted their deck black. That was their camouflage. Disguised like that, Yamato was heading to attack the American Navy in Leyte Gulf.
The Japanese were confident.
Yamato was built to win any battle, with any battleship in the world. Both his crew and the whole of the Japanese Navy believed that he had that power.
The U.S. Navy knew the Japanese fleets were on the move, but not their route nor their destination. The invasion of the Philippines was under serious threat. Just after midnight, on October 23, 1944, the larger of the two Japanese fleets that made up Center Group, heading for the Philippines, passed north of the island of Palawan. Ahead of the fleet were two submarines, USS Dace and USS Darter. The American crews couldn't believe their luck.
I think the submarine's reaction would have been that of any submariner. Yippee! You have got the enemy in a good position to attack them. And catching enemy combat units, battleships, unawares is what every submariner dreams of.
Dace and Darter were part of a highly successful American combat submarine fleet. Sub-commanders were given freedom to act on their own initiative. And they were in charge of vessels that were tailor-made for the Pacific.
The Americans had produced a very effective fleet submarine, it was called that. And as well as its duty of sinking Japanese merchantmen, which did with great effect, these submarines were used in support of the American fleet as long-range pickets and as ways of inflicting attrition on an advancing fleet.
This was the task assigned to subs Dace and Darter in the waters west of the Philippines. At 5:32 a.m. on October 23rd, they attacked Admiral Curita's center force. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun.
The submarines charge ahead on the surface at full speed to get into a position where they could dive to make an attack. And both submarines launch very successful torpedo attacks on the Japanese force, hitting 3 cruisers, including Kurita's flagship. As his cruiser sinks, it sinks so quickly that he has to swim through it. He's picked up by a destroyer, and that destroyer then transfers him to the super battleship Yamato, where he then takes control of his fleet again. Losing 3 ships, 2 sunk, 1 badly damaged, before you've even got to grips with your main enemy force is not a good start by any stretch of the imagination.
Despite the submarine attack, Admiral Curita was still on course for Leyte Gulf. The Japanese pincer is taking shape. But now the Americans know they're coming.
The sighting reports that the American submarines send out allow American aircraft carriers to launch 3 devastating attacks on Kurita's force.
The American planes hit them again, 200 miles from Leyte Gulf. Yamato's sister ship Musashi was hit by 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes. She lost power, so her mighty guns were helpless, locked in position.
The Musashi is hit numerous times by heavy bombs and eventually capsizes and sinks.
1,000 men went down with the ship. It seemed the mighty Yamato was next.
These are very heavy attacks. They disrupt Kurita's fleet. And the Yamato, this wonderful ship, super battleship, is damaged. 2,000 tons of water come into the ship. However, given the size of the Yamato, 2,000 tons of water is not a big deal. These warships are designed to absorb this sort of damage and continue, as Yamato does.
Curita was undeterred, and the U.S. fleet was vulnerable too. The Japanese launched their own air attacks from bases on the Philippines. Northwest of the islands, the carrier USS Princeton was hit by a single bomb from a Japanese plane. As the cruiser USS Birmingham came alongside to fight the fires, the Princeton blew up, killing over 600 men. The battle had only just begun. By late afternoon of October 24th, the Japanese center group had lost 1 battleship and 4 heavy cruisers. Still, Admiral Kurita continued his relentless push toward Leyte. His fleet was still dangerous. But American pilots, fired up by their success, overestimated the number of enemy ships they destroyed. The officer in charge of the U.S. Third Fleet, Admiral Bull Halsey, was convinced that Kurita's center group was no longer a threat.
Admiral Bill Halsey was a very confident man. He had a record of success. He was known for his aggression. He was known for one who attacked. He was very plain-spoken.
The Japanese knew Bull Halsey lived up to his name. He could be reckless. And they had set up a trap for him. The U.S. Third Fleet provided vital cover for the American forces invading the Philippines in October 1944. In charge of the fleet was Admiral Bull Halsey, one of the Navy's most experienced officers. He believed that mistakes had been made in recent campaigns, most notably at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944.
He believed that his friend Raymond Spruance, who commanded the Battle of the Philippine Sea the previous June, had lost a tremendous opportunity to destroy the Japanese carrier force by requiring the carriers to stay near to the beachhead. He believed that if he had been turned loose to go get the Japanese, he could have ended the war right there in the Philippine Sea.
Halsey didn't want to make the same mistake again. He wanted the freedom to seek and destroy.
When his orders were written for the Leyte Gulf operation, he asked Admiral Nimitz to put an additional codicil into the orders that if the opportunity arises to attack and destroy the main Japanese battle fleet, that would become his highest priority.
Halsey was obsessed with destroying Japanese aircraft carriers. Pearl Harbor had convinced him that they were the future of naval combat.
Pearl Harbor also showed that the battleship was no longer the primary weapon of the navies. It was going to be the aircraft carrier. It had an offensive range that way exceeded any gun range of the ships at the time, between 20 and 25 miles, versus having an attack range of probably between 150 and 200 miles. There's a big difference.
The aircraft carrier has become the dominant surface ship, and it is now the queen of the battle space.
At the heart of Show 1, the Japanese plan of attack was an ingenious trap. They knew Admiral Halsey was obsessed with aircraft carriers. He might just fall for a decoy carrier attack.
The decoy plan was that what was left of the Japanese carrier force would come down from the north and show itself to the American carriers and the fleet in general. This would draw Admiral Halsey, who was known to be rather an impetuous admiral, and the Japanese studied the psychology of their opponents, up north.
With the idea that once we've taken away Halsey and his protection of the invasion, and therefore all of these transports, all of the shipping, all of the men who are ashore, that they can be crushed by a convergence of two other Japanese fleets. This is, in essence, what Show 1 is designed to create.
Halsey had no idea that the Japanese had him in their sights. He had picked his third fleet carefully. If he had the opportunity to attack the Japanese, he wanted vessels that were fast enough to reach them. One of the combat ships he selected was a battleship, the USS Alabama.
USS Alabama was designed to be a fast attack battleship. Fast attack battleships were necessary to keep up with the fairly modern U.S. carrier fleet that had been developed. Some of the features about the ship The obvious one are the large 16-inch 45 caliber guns. These guns were accurate to a range of 21 miles. The ship also possessed 10 5-inch 38 caliber mounts. This could be used for both shore bombardment and anti-aircraft purposes.
The crew of the Alabama at Leyte Gulf was a cross-section of American society.
Men from the city, men from the country. Every type of man was represented aboard the Alabama. That breed is called the greatest generation, and for a reason. They, almost to a man, signed up to do this. And it was a very special time in American history and in world history.
The Alabama had cutting-edge technology, the very latest in radar.
Radar worked best if you had a big ship, because then you could put your radar aerials that much higher up, and that means you can see a lot further.
The Alabama's radar system was called SK-2. It was designed especially for larger ships.
The old SK radar systems picked up aerial attacks at about 150 miles away. The new SK-2 could pick up attacks as far as 250 miles away, so they had a 100-mile advantage with the new system.
A Japanese long-range fighter flew at about 300 miles per hour. So the SK-2 gave around 45 minutes for a ship to prepare for an attack. The SK-2 was so sensitive, it could detect not just aircraft, but incoming shells. 4 months before Leyte, the Alabama and her radar system made a name for themselves during the Battle of the Philippine Sea.
It was in this very room that the first radar technicians encountered the oncoming Japanese attack.
They literally saw the Japanese coming 250 miles away. The Americans shot down so many Japanese aircraft, the battle was nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
It would have been a surprise attack, not unlike that on Pearl Harbor, and over 500 enemy planes in that subsequent battle were destroyed.
We sank several Japanese aircraft carriers, and we lost no significant American assets. In some respects, this was a triumph of technology.
The Japanese Naval Air Wing never truly recovered from that day, and all of that took place in this room as the Alabama detected that oncoming attack.
The crew of the Alabama were eager to repeat their success. On the afternoon of October 24th, 4 days after the invasion at Leyte Gulf began, American aircraft spotted the Japanese carrier force heading south. This was what Bull Halsey had been waiting for.
So the carriers, even weak carriers, even half carriers, were a draw to the Americans, and in this particular case, of course, to Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr.
In fact, it was a decoy. It was meant to lead Halsey north and away from the Leyte landings.
The Japanese carrier force was led by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, but his carriers had hardly any aircraft. Ozawa was on a suicide mission.
He felt honor-bound to complete that mission, even though his forces were very weak. He had only one fleet carrier, a couple of small carriers, light carriers, so this is not a genuine threat to the American fleet off the Philippines.
Halsey, convinced that he'd earlier successfully destroyed Kurita's center group, sent the entire Third Fleet, including the USS Alabama, to intercept Ozawa's northern force.
So he fell, for all practical purposes, into the Japanese trap laid for him.
And he goes off on a wild goose chase, at the same time not coordinating for the defense of that invasion group that's left at Leyte.
His staff knew that it was the wrong decision. And it says something about the man, too, that his staff was afraid to tell him point blank.
General MacArthur's forces on Leyte were left unprotected. As Halsey charged north, Kurita's fleet and the Southern Force now approached the invasion beaches. Halsey's bravado meant that the Americans were in danger of being caught in the Japanese pincer. On the morning of October 24th, as Admiral Halsey pursued the Japanese fleet to the north, American aircraft spotted the Japanese Southern Force heading for Leyte Gulf. It consisted of 2 squadrons, 18 ships in total, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. 57-year-old Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf of the U.S. 7th Fleet was given the task of eliminating them.
One of the strengths of the U.S. military system in World War II that Oldendorf represented was the fact that men could come up. If they were deemed competent, they were given the job.
He's a battleship guy, and he had great familiarity with battleship tactics. He will be able then to find the right place, the right naval topography, if you will, and the right time to employ those big gun tactics that he's become quite familiar with.
Admiral Oldendorf had a task force with 6 old battleships. 5 had been badly damaged at Pearl Harbor, the West Virginia, the California, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, the Maryland, and the Pennsylvania. Their crews were out to settle a score.
I think what would have fired the American crews was the opportunity for revenge for Pearl Harbor. This was a surprise attack before war had been declared. It broke a number of taboos as far as the Americans were concerned about how war should be fought. And that thirst for revenge would have motivated the crews.
Admiral Oldendorf's plan was to use the geography of the islands to his advantage. It would get the enemy exactly where he wanted them.
The Japanese attacked up through Surigao Strait, which narrows the approach to Leyte Gulf like a funnel, so that Oldendorf could place his old battleships, some of them Pearl Harbor survivors, and his heavy cruisers in a line across Surigao Strait, so the Japanese had no option but to steam directly into them.
Oldendorf wrote later,
"If the Japanese were suckers enough to try to come through the straits, I wasn't going to give them a chance."
Oldendorf was meticulous in his planning. He placed 39 PT boats on either side of the approach to the strait, ready to ambush the Southern Force as they passed. 28 destroyers would strike further up the strait, before Oldendorf and his old battleships would pick off any survivors. At midnight on October 24th, the PT boats fired their torpedoes. Oldendorf's destroyers joined in the ambush. He said,
"It was the kind of naval battle you dream about. We had them under crossfire and were able to hit them with guns and torpedoes at the same time."
About 14 Japanese warships made it to the strait, where Oldendorf was waiting with his battleships and cruisers. They were the last line of defense before Leyte Gulf. Oldendorf then deployed an old naval tactic, first used by wooden battleships, a strategy known as crossing the T. It was what every battleship was built to do.
This maneuver dated back more than 300 years. The object was to maximize broadside firepower, so that crossing element of the T was getting your broadsides firing against an advancing enemy who had very few guns bearing on the target.
The objective is to get a line of warships across the top of an advancing enemy. All guns are able to be brought to bear in a devastating bombardment. The enemy can only fire their guns on the ships at the front. Their rear guns can only hit their own ships, rendering them useless. Just before 4 a.m., Oldendorf's fleet of old battleships and cruisers opened fire. They unleashed a massive bombardment from 18 16-inch guns, 48 14-inch guns, 27 8-inch guns, and 43 6-inch guns. The Japanese sailed into an inferno.
For the Japanese, when they meet Oldendorf's battleships, it must have been nothing short of terrifying. The first indication that they had that they were in trouble was when the horizon would have been ripped apart by the opening fire of the American battleships at a range of about 11 miles.
It was a decisive and historic moment. One officer on board the cruiser, the USS Louisville, wrote,
"This was exactly the sort of scenario dreamed of, studied, and plotted in War College maneuvers, and never hoped to be obtained."
And the Japanese fleet was quite literally wiped out. Only a single destroyer survived to make its way back and report the disaster that occurred to the southern Japanese.
Oldendorf had crossed the T and won the last battleship versus battleship action in history. But still, the Japanese kept coming. To the north, Admiral Kurita's center group now sailed through the San Bernardino Strait, unopposed, and turned south for Leyte Gulf. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, tasked with defending the strait, was instead 300 miles away, chasing Ozawa's decoy fleet. At 6:30 a.m. on October 25th, U.S. aircraft finally spotted the Japanese center group. Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, in charge of 4 carriers to the north of Leyte Gulf, was stunned.
When Ziggy Sprague got his report that morning from a pilot that said, Japanese battleships and cruisers 20 miles away and closing at 30 knots, he said, that can't be true, recheck that, that can't be right. And the pilot flew down and said, I just saw the largest Japanese flag I ever saw flying on the largest battleship I've ever seen.
It was the Yamato, with 3 other battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers beside her. Admiral Sprague was furious. Where was Halsey? All Sprague had to take on Kurita's 4 battleships, including Yamato's massive guns, was a force of escort carriers, known as Taffy 3.
Taffy 3, the escort carriers and their destroyers, were almost suicidally brave. The mismatch between the Japanese and American forces was huge.
The Japanese were fighting without a tomorrow. There was a sense that so much was at stake, and for the Japanese it was. Their orders were, you're going to do this or die.
On the one hand, you have the super battleship Yamato, and on the other hand, you've got the USS Johnston. The USS Johnston, complete, weighed as much as just one of the gun turrets on the Yamato. These are massive differences. 18.1-inch shells going one way and 5-inch shells going the other.
The Johnson was led by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans.
And he drove his ship straight at the Japanese battleships, taking terrible losses. And when one of those giant battleship shells hit his ship, his gunnery officer later wrote that it was like a puppy being smacked by a truck. This is really the David versus Goliath confrontation. It looks to everyone who watches on both sides like these Americans are going to be shunted aside. The Japanese will go into Leyte Gulf, sink the entire invasion fleet, and really throw the entire invasion into a cocked hat.
But after 2 hours of battle, it was Admiral Kurita who decided to retreat. Reports of Admiral Oldendorf's victory to the south and the confusion of the battle finally made him lose his resolve.
The Japanese Navy was prepared to lose their whole fleet in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So it is somehow regrettable that midway through it, Kurita lost his resolve to fight to the last ship. To this day, nobody really understands the decision Vice Admiral Kurita took at that moment. But it is evident that as a result, he was not able to accomplish his original goal.
The Showa victory plan was in tatters, but Kurita's fleet still survives. To the north, Admiral Halsey picked up pleas for help from the carrier force Taffy 3. He finally realized he'd been deliberately lured away from Leyte by Admiral Ozawa's decoy fleet.
It was extraordinary that even at that stage of the war, pretty near the end, that Halsey could still make a pretty big mistake. So we must never think that either code breaking or radar or any sort of technology changes the need. You've got to have smart admirals who make the right decisions.
By now, Ozawa's carriers were in range. Decoy or not, they were a tempting target. At 8 a.m., Halsey's aircraft attacked. Meanwhile, back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz, in charge of Pacific Naval Strategy, couldn't understand why Halsey hadn't come to Taffy 3's aid with a fleet of fast ships called Task Force 34.
So he sends a message to Halsey saying, "Where is Task Force 34? That's the message. But every message sent in World War II has padding at the front and at the back, nonsense phrases added to make it difficult for the enemy to decode the message.
But the extra phrases were mistakenly left on the message.
So when it's delivered to Halsey on his quarterdeck, it says, "Where is," repeat, "where is Task Force 34? All the world wonders." And Halsey is furious, leaves the quarterdeck and goes down to his cabin for an hour.
Halsey wrote later,
"I was stunned, as if I had been struck in the face. I snatched off my cap, threw it on the deck, and shouted something I am ashamed to remember."
Halsey thought Nimitz was embarrassing him in front of the entire United States fleet because these messages are received not just on the flagship, but on any ship that has a decoding capability, which is any major ship.
It's an hour before the angry Halsey turns his fleet around and steams south.
If he had done that initially, they could have gotten back to San Bernardino Strait to prevent the Japanese from escaping, but it's, of course, too late now.
Admiral Kurita escaped. However, the Yamato and the other surviving ships would be ineffective for the remainder of the war. But there was still to be another historic twist in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. On the morning of October 25th, 1944, 6 Japanese Zero bombers approached an American carrier group, Taffy 1. To the sailors, it looked like an ordinary bombing run. But it was the start of a new tactic. The fuel-heavy planes were not just carrying missiles. They were the missiles. It was the very first kamikaze attack. Japanese Admiral Onishi wrote in September,
"We can no longer win by adhering to conventional methods of warfare. The enemy can be stopped only by crash diving on their carrier flight decks with Zero fighters carrying 250-kilogram bombs."
Two of the 6 Zeros got through and hit the escort carriers Santee and Suwannee. Both ships survived. But 3 hours later, a kamikaze penetrated the hangar deck of the carrier St. Lo before exploding. She sank minutes later. One weapon would succeed in taking out scores of kamikazes. It's been called the gun that won World War II. The 5-inch .38 caliber. One Leyte Gulf survivor bristles with them. This is the battleship USS Iowa.
This gun was mounted on virtually every United States Navy destroyer, on cruisers and battleships. It was probably the most produced medium-sized gun in the world. Thousands and thousands of these guns were built.
The 5-inch .38 caliber's high rate of fire made it the perfect anti-aircraft gun.
They were very reliable. You could fire these guns as fast as you could load them, manually loaded. 15 to 20 rounds a minute were typical, up to 22 rounds a minute with a good trained crew.
In the early years of the Second World War, the most common type of 5-inch shell exploded on impact. But these shells weren't effective against fast-moving, weaving aircraft. So military technicians devised a shell fitted with what was called a proximity fuse that exploded close to a target using the latest radar technology. Once fired, the proximity fuse sends out radio waves, searching for a target. When the shell is close to a target, the radio waves are reflected back, triggering a firing circuit which explodes the shell. The shell's internal electronics were designed to withstand the 14,000 G-force acceleration as it flew down the gun barrel at 2,600 feet per second. These proximity fuses helped the Pacific Fleet's life and death fight against the kamikazes.
Iowa was in combat in the Philippines and was attacked by a Japanese aircraft. These guns we're looking at right now fired a single proximity fuse shell. The fire controlman up in the director said, "One instant I was watching an airplane flying through the air. The next instant it was just an engine. The airplane was gone." One round did that.
By sunset on October 26, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was effectively over. The Japanese fleets limped home. They had lost 26 vessels, including 6 heavy cruisers, 4 carriers, and 3 battleships. The American Navy lost 6 vessels. However, the Japanese Show 1 plan had almost worked.
The Japanese tried to get in amongst the invasion fleet. If they had done that, it would have been quite a disaster for the United States. And they came remarkably close to succeeding when you think about it. The most powerful fleet had the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, managed to get within 20 miles of the beachhead.
The USS Iowa was one of the last battleships ever built. The end of the Second World War marked the end of the battleship. Leyte Gulf was their final shot at glory.
Battleships had their last hurrah in that confrontation. The oversized battleships, the super battleships, Yamato and Musashi, that the Japanese believed could even the battlefield for them in a confrontation with the American Navy. They found they could not stand up to repeated attacks by carrier-based American airplanes. So in a way, what we have in the Battle of Leyte Gulf is both the last hurrah of the old battleships and the demonstration of the superiority of carrier aircraft as the dominant weapon of war.
Never again will the world see such an epic naval battle.
Leyte Gulf is a microcosm of naval warfare. Anything you want to see, you can find there. You can find battleships, you can find submarines, you can find kamikazes, airplanes, everything. And it's such an intensity of action over a short period of time.
Leyte Gulf was the final decisive defeat of the Japanese fleet. Never again would the Japanese fleet operate as a unit. The Japanese came so close to a major victory that might have put the Americans back by months, but they were close, but not successful.